To quote the theme tune to the kids' TV show Round the Twist, "Rain, rain, go away, come again another day." Because that's what the FIA was shouting at the clouds during the Belgian Grand Prix yesterday. And this caused a bit of a kerfuffle online. We had Silverstone start normally as well as Melbourne, so why is Spa any different? And it led to constant complaints on social media about just let them race, just put the wet tyres on, just do this, why don't they just do that, it's not that difficult. And I've said in previous editions of these current affairs videos, if your solution starts with just, or they should just, or something along those lines, then the chances are your solution isn't that simple. And just before the Grand Prix was due to start, so 3 PM local time, rain got absolutely dumped onto the track. This being after the Formula 3 race was abandoned due to the torrential conditions, much like the race had been abandoned at Silverstone 3 weeks ago. Although the Spa F3 race was completely abandoned with no points awarded whatsoever. There were fears that this could happen with the F1 race, given what had happened in 2021, although the rules and regulations have been changed since then so that we don't have a repeat of that race. And while people were quick to say it's just a bit of water, let them race, they're supposed to be the 20 best drivers in the world, why can't they race on a little bit of water? The bit that everybody needs to understand here is that the problem isn't so much the grip and the intermediate tyres would have been sufficient for those conditions. The actual problem they have is spray. It's not the grip that's the problem, it's the spray. That's the bit we need to make abundantly clear. The memes on the internet were all about the lesser spotted blue Pirelli tyre, and why do they have it when there's nobody using it? The answer, once again, is spray. After Singapore in 2022, I did a video called "Does Formula 1 Fear the Rain?" and the thumbnail for that video was Tsunoda in the rain on the full wets at Singapore. But all that stuff has come around again. If this was Monaco, they would have lightly raced, because the speeds are lower. But Spa has quite a high average speed, and has 2 very long, very fast sections, plus Eau Rouge and Raidillon. Being blind through Eau Rouge and Raidillon isn't my idea of fun. And it's all down to how the cars work. With these ground effect cars, air goes through the Venturi tunnels, accelerates, and creates a low pressure pocket that allows the car to be sucked down to the ground. But Bernoulli's principle, which is what ground effect utilises, isn't just for air. It's for fluids as a whole. Air is a fluid, but so is water. So when you factor in the cars being designed to utilise ground effect and also having those massive and complicated diffusers on the back, the cars get turned into 200-mile-an-hour pressure washers, with water being fired out the back like, well, a pressure washer. Times that by 20 and you've got thick wads of water being flung out the back. And it gets worse when the full wets are brought into the equation. The wets work by allowing water to flow into the tread blocks and allow the tyre to get purchased on the road. Otherwise it sits on top of the water on the road and you can't make contact with the tarmac, and that's why you spin off using slicks. The issue with these wets is you have a lot of water going to these cuts on these massive tyres, and when that wheel is spinning at, well, however many revolutions a minute at 150, 160, 170 miles an hour, the water in those channels has to go somewhere. It's flicked off up into the air and it comes back down. Again, times that by 20 and you have spray that is impossible to see in, as Isaac Hadjar found out at Silverstone. He drilled Antonelli into Copse Corner simply because he couldn't see him, even with those big red lights flashing away on the back of the car. And it's not until you go onto a racetrack that you realise how bright those rain lights and those flag lights at the side of the track actually are. And when you're at the front of the field like Lando was and you're complaining you can't see anything, then what are the people behind him able to see? Less than nothing? And yes, it does seem that Formula 1 treats the wet conditions with kid gloves, especially in the last 10 years. And people will be quick to point out the utterly horrendous 1998 race where so many cars wiped out on the run down to Eau Rouge. But that was the 90s, and things were different in terms of how things were approached. It would be interesting to see how different the amount of spray was in those days, because in that 1998 race it didn't look too bad. But then again, I am watching the TV cameras and not from a driver's point of view. But there is another thing to consider, particularly with Spa, and that is Eau Rouge and Raidillon. Amazing corners in the dry and a challenge in the wet. But there is the fear that we might see a carbon copy of the Antoine Hubert accident, where Antoine was T-boned by Juan Manuel Correa in the Formula 2 race at Spa in 2019. And that was a horrendous accident in the dry. All it would take is one driver unsighted in the wet to do the exact same thing, and who knows what the outcome might be. And then the ones saying let them race would be saying how is this allowed to happen if it was their driver that was injured or worse. Just 2 years ago in Formula Regional, Delano Vanterhoff was killed when he was involved in a Hubert-style collision on the exit of Radion in blinding spray. Now, I'm not saying that it will happen. I'm saying that this is a potential outcome that the FIA would rather avoid happening again. Blind into Eau Rouge and Radion, I can understand why they made the decision they did. If it had been drier there and wetter everywhere else, it probably wouldn't have been so bad. But because it's Eau Rouge, that's why. I do think they could have started the race a little bit earlier than they actually did though. I'm just going to file this under I don't agree but I understand why. So as it was, we had a rain delay. So I went to the pub. Took my parents out for lunch. An hour and 20 minutes went by of just waiting, and not for the first time in these sorts of situations. At exactly 20 minutes past 3 British bias time, they started out, did a couple of laps, and we had a rolling start. IndyCar style. And the race was won within the first sector, much like it had been with the sprint race. And that's due to the nature of the circuit at Spa. You have La Source and then it's a flat out run through the Eau Rouge and Radion section all the way up the Kemmel Straight towards Les Combes. If you mess up any of that section, you're a sitting duck. You need the perfect exit of La Source, you need to keep your speed and momentum high through Eau Rouge and up the hill and maximise your top speed on the Kemmel Straight. So in effect, second place on the grid at Spa is pole position. So Oscar made good use of a Lando slide out of La Source and kept the car pinned through Eau Rouge, so he was right on the back of his teammate as they entered the Kemmel Straight. And that took balls. The move was done before they even got to the next braking zone, and that was it, pretty much. Lando stayed in second but had to manage a battery issue that sorted itself out after a bit, and the two McLarens started to pull away from Leclerc and Verstappen behind. Max had done the same thing in the sprint race, and with his low downforce setup, he was able to outdrag Oscar down Kemmel and take the lead into Les Combes. And then he'd keep Oscar behind in the twisty bits before pulling out again between Stavelot and the bus stop. I think Oscar's DRS only had about 8 km an hour of extra oomph in the sprint race because of how slippery the Red Bull was. But then, Red Bull chose a higher downforce setup for the race, anticipating the race to be wetter than it was, only for them to be presented with a drying track, and it made those who went with a more wet-minded setup lose out a tiny bit towards the end. And as such, Max struggled to catch and overtake Leclerc, who had a bit less drag on his car. But one person who didn't have trouble overtaking in the early part of the race was Lewis Hamilton. Hamilton simply was not having a good weekend. He was out of the first qualifying session in the sprint, and again for the main race despite having a time good enough for 7th in the first qualifying session, but that time was deleted for cutting the top of Radion. But in the race, Hamilton started moving his way up after starting from the pit lane, managing the car in the conditions to overtake Sainz at the end of lap 7, which was actually the second lap of the race because of the Prix running behind the safety car, then Colapinto on lap 8 into Les Combes, Hulk into the bus stop at the end of lap 8, and worked his way up to 13th, before pitting not long after. Hamilton had apparently got a new performance engineer brought in to partner him and his race engineer as part of a background reshuffle at the team. It's not clear on who this new engineer is, but Hamilton has also hinted that it's somebody he used to work with at Mercedes. Hamilton had also been using a new component that did something to the brake migration, and it's thought that that led to his spin in sprint qualifying, as he hadn't worked out how to get around the new driving characteristics. But having gone to a wet setup between Friday and Saturday, it seemed to have done him alright when climbing through the field, doing most of the climbing with his early stop for medium tyres. A good recovery and damage limitation, but it would be a case of where he would have been if not for having his time deleted. Leclerc has apparently been using this thing since Canada, and he binned it when using it for the first time as well. And the pit stops did shake things up a bit. When Oscar, Charles and Max pitted, Max was less than half a second behind the Ferrari, and almost got past Charles when he made a mistake into La Source. But when the pit stops happened, Max lost a second or so having to wait for Albon to go past, and Leclerc was right on the edge of being pinged for an unsafe release. And usually, you see people complaining about that, but I haven't seen anything about it since, which is rare. Verstappen was stationary for 4.8 seconds as a result of the wait, and that made him vulnerable to Russell on the next lap, as Max, Russell, Ocon and Albon all headed through Bonchemont, almost inside each other. Everybody except Norris took medium tyres. Lando was the only one to take hards, and the expectation was that the medium runners would have to stop again. Hulkenberg and a couple of others near the back did stop again, but the rest of them just carried on. The overlap between the hards and mediums did kick in, but maybe it was a bit too late. With about 10 laps to go, Lando started eating into Oscar's lead, which had been about 9 seconds or so, and the gap had initially opened due to a slow stop for Lando when he took the hard tyres. But Lando gave Oscar some breathing room a couple of times. He went off the road at Pouhon with a snap of oversteer on lap 26 and also locked his wheel into La Source. You know how I mentioned how messing up La Source can cost you earlier in this video? Well, Lando lost 7/10 doing that lockup. That corner really is the definition of slow in, fast out, much like Arnage at Le Mans. But going off at Pouhon lost him 1.2 seconds, so that's almost 2 seconds drop to Oscar with 2 mistakes. With 5 laps to go, the gap dropped to 5.5, which would have been 3.8 without the mistakes. The hard tyres were now starting to work better than the mediums, and Lando was told this over the radio. With 3 laps to go, the gap was 3.6, 1.9 without the mistakes, but Oscar was managing things brilliantly. But at the end of lap 42 of the 44, Lando was now 3 seconds behind. Without the 2 mistakes at Pouhon and La Source, he would have been on the cusp of DRS. But as we'd seen over the course of the race, DRS wasn't doing much unless you were on a dry setup. On the penultimate lap, he messed up La Source again, and that was it. Race done. 3.5 seconds was the gap at the end. Maybe Lando would have caught Oscar towards the end, but even if he had, there's still the whole getting past thing to consider. Leclerc was 20 seconds behind the winner, with Max having a good view of the back of the Ferrari for virtually the whole race, and Verstappen finished a so-solid 21 seconds behind Oscar. Russell finished a quiet 5th, and Max finishing ahead plus the sprint race victory means that his performance-related release clause can now no longer be triggered, so we're going to have to wait on all of that to emerge over the summer, with Albon finishing a brilliant 6th for Williams. Hamilton, Lawson, Bortoletto and Gasly made up the rest of the top 10, with 8 of the 10 teams being represented. But the main thing that's emerged from all of this is, what if they did race in the rain? And that's always going to be an impossible question to answer. Some have been saying that Max would have won it easily, but some think one of the McLarens would have still won. But at the same time, you never know who's going to fall off the road due to catching a puddle at the wrong angle on the wrong lap. And the whole setup thing messed Red Bull around last time at Silverstone, as they went for a drier setup anticipating a drier race, but the weather decided otherwise. But Red Bull weren't the only ones to change things around in between the races. Mercedes took wing off Russell's car in between the sprint and the Grand Prix, and Antonelli's start from the pit lane was so Mercedes could add wing. The Astons put extra wing on as well, with this race being an absolute disaster for Team Silverstone. Probably their worst race on record, and according to data compiled by the race, it seemed that Verstappen piled on the most downforce in between Saturday and Sunday. So in the words of another YouTubist, who had a banger and who had a clanger? Piastri gets a banger award for managing the pace up at the front and making Lando make mistakes as he tried to catch up, as well as not making any mistakes of his own. Hamilton also gets a banger award for undoing everything that happened in the 2 qualifying sessions. But there will always be that what if my time wasn't deleted thing. Albon also did well, as did Bortoletto, finishing 9th and continuing Sauber's great run of form at the minute. And Charles, another podium for him. I think that's his 4th in 6 races or something ridiculous like that. The Ferrari setup was more on the dry end of things, and that made him vulnerable to Verstappen in the early stages, but he managed to hold him off. And going back to Albon for a second, he had to deal with Hamilton harassing him for over half the Grand Prix, and staved him off, although Hamilton's setup was more on the wet side, so that helped him a bit. The clangers go to Antonelli, who seems to be on a bad run of form since his podium at Montreal, and Sainz, who has once again finished well off compared to his teammate, and must be wondering what he has to do, since he didn't start in Austria, was 12th while Albon scored at Silverstone despite starting behind Sainz, and now he was 18th at Spa. Although he did get 6th in the sprint, so there is that, but still 6th down to 18th. And there's the Aston drivers as well, who piled on the downforce anticipating a much wetter race, but Stroll was 14th and Alonso 17th with a pit lane start. And it is actually Aston's worst weekend in Formula 1 according to the race. Then there's Hadjar, who struggled with problems with his car, and he was the only car not on the lead lap come the end. Oh, I almost forgot, I need to do the pub trivia. So this race victory was the 8th of Piastri's Formula 1 career, and it ties him with Norris. It also ties him with Leclerc, which means all 3 drivers that were stood on the podium yesterday have 8 victories. The guest of honour that waved the checkered flag was Jackie Ickx, who has, funnily enough, 8 Grand Prix victories. I almost let that one slip through the net, I do apologise. But the big discussion will still be the rain and what Formula 1 has to do. Max and Lewis were happy to go racing in it a bit earlier than they actually started, but the FIA seemed to have other ideas. And it does make you wonder what the decision would have been if it had been drier through Sector 1 and wetter everywhere else. And Eau Rouge being the sort of complex it is, making the FIA take a bit more caution about things. But like I said, it is what it is, and we still got a race. A dull one, admittedly, but not every race can be a banger, and I've seen people saying that Spa is usually a bit on the quieter side, but that's for you to have a debate about. Although the big conspiracy theory now is that the FIA is on McLaren's payroll and they delayed the start to stop Verstappen creaming them all in the rain. F1 social media never changes. With Lando having got the better of Oscar at Austria and Oscar being penalised for his brake test at Silverstone, which handed Lando the win, Piastri needed to bounce back and show that he still got it. And he did. While the sprint race was lost before turn 5 due to running more downforce than the Red Bull, on Sunday he did exactly the same thing that Max did to him to win the race before the end of Sector 1. And Piastri's calm demeanour on track allowed him to just manage the pace on those mediums, with Lando making a couple of errors in his bid to close the gap as the tyre performances started to swap over, the mediums losing and the hards gaining, or keeping as the case may be. As a result, Oscar's lead has been extended back out, up to 16 points, but it's still not a foregone conclusion and there's still plenty of races to run over the course of the season. After watching Lando put on the drive we know he can put on in Austria, this race seemed to be a return to the Lando of old. The one that, when put under a bit of pressure, makes a mistake that puts him on the back foot. 4 seconds lost with 3 mistakes, and that cost him an opportunity to maybe force Oscar into the error, which we have actually seen him do this season with the near miss at the Red Bull Ring. But this was a race where Oscar's pace was simply too much for Lando to overcome. Being too close at the pit stop phase meant that Lando lost time being on intermediates that were as bald as I am when he came in, while those on dries were able to pound in a faster lap. This, coupled with the slow pit stop, might have at the same time put the race beyond doubt. And next up is Hungary, a track notoriously difficult to overtake at, and if Oscar is in front of Lando again, Lando will struggle to get by. He absolutely will struggle to get by, simply because Oscar has a much cooler head on his shoulders and got better racecraft. For the rest of the season, Lando is going to have to do what the Lionesses did all through the Euros. Dig deep and go down absolutely swinging. This championship will no doubt be going all the way to Abu Dhabi. Now Lando has shown that he has got it in some cases. Austria is the main one, but his inconsistency has been an issue. Oscar has had his moments admittedly, but his dry patches haven't been anything like Lando's. Lando did bounce back after his bad race in Canada, and Oscar's bounced back now. So don't be surprised if Oscar can hold it a little bit longer over the next few races. Although after Hungary there is the summer break, so who knows if that will shake things up a little bit. But again, anything can happen in Formula 1 and it usually does. But Oscar certainly is the favourite and has been since, well, Miami really. But I suppose we're going to keep constantly checking the weather reports for Budapest this week to see what the weather's going to be like at the Hungaroring this weekend. Although with the lower speeds the spray is going to be a little bit less, so if it does rain we should be able to go racing, but we'll wait and see. So then, a look at the Belgian Grand Prix and everything else that came with it. Although Lando messed up and Piastri had a controlled run at the front seems to be a recurring theme of this year, doesn't it? We're entering Hamilton wins and Vettel spins territory again. But if you have enjoyed this video, then do get a like put down on it so I know I've done a good job, and for more current F1 affairs or the history stuff that I do, there's a subscribe button to click and a bell to ring so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the mad lads over at Patreon who keep this channel running at a more personal level, and if you want to help with the picture purchasing or other expenses, there's a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks for one and done donations and memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.